This is Dr. Weisslugel, and this is a very brief introductory presentation about Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism and how that relates to our discussions about ethics. There's a picture of Jean-Paul Sartre right there with his friend, his companion, his love, Simone de Beauvoir, an important existentialist philosopher, novelist, and thinker, feminist writer in her own right. Okay, so a little background about Sartre's books. He wrote a big doorstopper kind of a book called Being and Nothingness. Large book, full of jargon, a little bit difficult to read, maybe a lot difficult to read, but it was in its own day quite famous. It even made it to a commercial. Back before the Energizer Bunny, there was this commercial on television of this lecture hall, one of those lecture theaters, and a light coming in through the windows showing dust particles in the air, a professor down front wearing a tweedy jacket with patches on the elbows, and a few sleepy students in the lecture theater, and he thunks down his book and says, "Being and nothingness," like that, and a student passes out from sleep. But the one smart student had his tape recorder there with fresh batteries in it, so he didn't really have to pay attention. He could listen to this whole lecture later, kind of like you're listening to a lecture now. So anyway, it was a famous book. Existentialism is a Humanism, a little book, actually just a talk that he gave that we're going to focus on in this discussion. The idea of the transcendence of the ego. It's a big word there, transcendence. The ego, the I, it's the Latin word for I, ego is, and the whole idea of Kantian philosophy was that the ego was transcendental, that he reached out into the noumenal world and imposed a kind of structure on it. But the ego itself was the basis of our experience. The structure of rationality, as we learned, is the basis of our experience. Well, Sartre was saying the transcendence of the ego was the ego itself is a constructed, configured kind of thing. Based on what? Based on nothing, primordially. So we'll see a little bit how that works, but the upshot is going to be even our own self is a kind of a choice. Something that we make as we go along. Later in his career, he wrote another big book, twice the size, really, of Being and Nothingness, called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, in effect, where he sort of scales back a little bit on his ideas of radical freedom that we'll be discussing in this presentation for a variety of reasons. He was also a novelist. He wrote a book called Nausea. I know you want to run out and get that for your beach reading this summer. But it's the nausea of an existence that has no built-in meaning to it, as we'll see. And he wrote a trilogy of novels called Roads to Freedom, which was about intellectuals at the time of the Nazi occupation of France. He wrote plays. One of his most famous is No Exit, with the extremely famous line in it, "Hell is other people." I think you could still Google No Exit and see an old black and white presentation of a television show where they performed this play No Exit. I think that's still out there available if you're interested. Anyway, so Sartre not only wrote academic philosophy books, but he wrote novels, he wrote plays. Extremely famous guy. When he died, they say 50,000 people streamed into the streets to pay their homage to the great philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Some key ideas of existentialism. Rarely do you get a philosophy that can be summed up in a three-word phrase, but in many respects, this three-word phrase will do it for existentialism. Existence precedes essence. Now, that's not a general metaphysical principle. It's not a general metaphysical principle. It's a principle that applies to us human beings. Manufactured things. Take, for example, a pen. What it is comes before the fact that it comes to exist. In other words, we don't discover pens, so to speak. Somebody thinks to himself or herself, it'd be great if I had some kind of instrument where I could kind of write down my thoughts. I get the idea, the essence of what it means to be a pen, a writing instrument, and then I proceed to manufacture that object and bring it into existence. So once a thing exists, like a pen, it has an essence built into it because we, the creators of pens, built it in to its existence. Whereas us human beings, existence precedes essence. First we come to exist, and then we have to figure out what that means to be a human being. Right? Only in our actions do we determine after the fact what it will have meant to have been a human being. So Sartre's position, as we'll see, is an atheistic position. An atheist believes that there's no God, so no cosmic designer, so no built-in designs to natural things. So human beings, we show up, we exist, and then we have to figure out what that means. Just the opposite of manufacturing things. We figure out what they mean even before we make them. That's why we make them, because we come up with an idea for them. For us humans, we exist, and we have to figure out, even make the idea of what it means to be human. This book, Being in Nothingness, well, it's about us, and you have a choice. Is being referring to human beings or nothingness referring to human beings? It turns out it's nothingness. For Sartre, the word being means it is in itself. It just is what it is, as we like to say. For human beings, he likes to think that we are a for itself. A human is a for itself. And for him, he interprets that as we are nothingness. Now, he's not disrespecting us. What he's saying is human beings are no set thing, like a pen or a laptop or a table. A human being is no set thing. That's what listen to it as no thingness. Human beings aren't things. We're freedoms for Sartre. Freedoms for ourselves to make ourselves what it will have meant to be human beings. So let's just dip right into this little essay, the speech, as it turned out, as it began. Existentialism is a humanism. It was a lecture from 1946, kind of interesting. In France, intellectuals are taken in some ways much more seriously than we take our intellectuals here in the United States, and there were what we would call promoters, like concert promoters. Suppose you want to be a concert promoter. What does that mean? Well, you say, I'm going to get Beyonce to come and sing, so I'm going to need a venue. I'm going to rent out a hall, an arena, and I'm going to pay a certain amount of money. I'm going to pay Beyonce a certain amount of money, and then I'm going to sell tickets. And I'm hoping that after I pay Beyonce and pay for the arena, I'll make a little money. Well, in France, there were actually lecture promoters. People said, look, we're going to rent out a hall. We're going to have Jean-Paul Sartre, who's a pretty famous thinker. We'll have him come and give a talk, and we'll sell tickets, and, who knows, maybe we'll make a little money. So they asked Sartre, well, okay, what are you going to call your talk? We got to make up posters, get the word out to sell some tickets. And he says, call it Existentialism is a Humanism. And I think the promoter said something like, the exorcist, a what, a who? That's too complicated. People won't even know what you're saying, what the title means. They won't know whether they should come to the talk or not because they won't know what it's about. But Sartre insisted, that's what I want to call this talk. Existentialism is a humanism. And the night of the event, the place was completely packed, sold out, standing room only. In fact, there were crowds of people in front of the hall trying to get anyway. Sartre took the subway to his talk. He comes up out of the subway station, walks up to the hall, and he sees all these people. He thinks, oh, great, it's the communists. They're here to protest me. It's a big protest. We'll see why the communists might have been mad at him as we go along. But the fact is, he was just tremendously popular kind of guy. So whoever he wanted to talk about, he wanted to talk about. Now, the context of this talk, well, 1946. So the Germans had occupied France from May of 1940 to December 1944. World War II ended in 1945. Much of Europe lay in ruins. The Holocaust was, understood in its enormous evil. Atomic bombs are being dropped. It's no wonder that people were questioning the basic nature of human existence and the existence of God. It's no wonder that there are these questions. And there's no wonder that some of the terminology that we'll see Sartre use has a very negative connotation. Why wouldn't you feel a bit negative about things? But Sartre's going to defend his doctrine of existentialism as being not as negative as it sounds, but you'll see the negativity. So the definition of existentialism: existence precedes essence. It begins from the subjective, from the I, from the ego, but it does imply an environment, including other people, including other eyes, including other freedoms, and it's about the human condition now, not the human nature, because he doesn't think humans have a built-in nature, but we're set in a context, in a condition, having to make ourselves what we will have become in the midst of other freedoms trying to do the same thing. And of course, when we butt heads like that, no wonder sometimes he could say hell is other people. It's all about our freedom. In fact, he says man is condemned to be free, even on the rack, a medieval torture device. Human beings are free. It's a kind of radical freedom. Existentialism is completely free, and we'll have to see what are the implications of that. Now, Sartre in this talk is basically defending his philosophy of existentialism against critics. So what are some of the complaints against this philosophy of atheism and radical freedom? Well, first, people say it's quietistic. It leads to a paralysis of action. If there's no built-in user's manual or game plan for human existence, why do anything? If life has no built-in meaning, if life has no meaning, why bother? Why even get out of bed? It's accused of promoting despair. Sartre is going to say we have no hope, right? There's no God who's going to swoop in at the end and save us from all our problems. Doesn't that leave us despairing, without hope? The philosophy was criticized as being bourgeois. In other words, individualistic, subjectivistic. It was not class conscious. It's all about the individual, about the I and their freedom. That's why Sartre was worried on the night of his talk about the communists showing up, because for communist thinkers, and by the way, communists were in many respects the good guys in France. Why? Because the communists were fighting the Nazis, and the Nazis had occupied France, so the communists were in a way kind of the good guys at the time, and they were bothered by Sartre's individualistic philosophy because it seemed to never understand the nature of the class nature of human consciousness. It was negative. They accused Sartre of always focusing on the negative qualities of human beings. It was solipsistic. That's a good word. That means there's nobody other than me. It's so self-centered. There's no sense of social solidarity in this radical freedom you're talking about, Sartre. It seems unserious. If there's no built-in right and wrong, it leads to what we call voluntarism, willfulness. Just whatever you feel like doing, do it. And that's an unserious philosophy. That's an amoral, maybe immoral philosophy. It's relativistic. It's absolutely relative in a sense. Doesn't it seem like it's absolutely impossible to judge others for their actions if there's no moral standard that's absolute that we can appeal to, like there was in Plato, or like there is in St. Thomas Aquinas, or even like there was in Kant in some ways. What about that? Sartre says, my philosophy has even become kind of a code word for vulgarity. He tells this little story of the society lady who was at a party and maybe had one too many champagnes or whatever, and a little swear word, a little cuss word leaked out like a little burp out of her mouth, and she says, "Ooh, I must be becoming an existentialist." In other words, existentialism is a synonymous for being a vulgarian of some kind, and the philosophy was faddish. The term existentialist was applied to artists and musicians and countercultural kind of people. It even started there was almost like a fashion trend. You could always tell the existentialists because they were at a cafe sipping an espresso, smoking a cigarette, probably in a cigarette holder, wearing a beret, wearing black clothes, and the men sporting a little goatee. There was a look about existentialists. So Sartre said, hey, you don't blame me about that. I wrote existentialism for technical philosophers. That's a very academic thing that I'm doing here. I can't help it if people pick this stuff up and turn it into some kind of fad. Now, I'm not sure if he's he's being fully sincere when he makes this protest. How exciting would it be if you had philosophical ideas and the next thing you know everybody's wearing a T-shirt with your face on it or something like that. Maybe he didn't like it, but maybe he didn't hate it as much as he seems to let on here. Anyway, it made a big splash. People picked it up. And once they picked it up, they did whatever they wanted to do with it. And it's not necessarily all Sartre's fault what they did with it. Just like people read Friedrich Nietzsche, and some of them, ended up being Nazis. It's not necessarily the case that Nietzsche would have liked Nazis, but maybe there's something in his work that allowed Nazis to find something of value in it, and maybe something in Sartre's work that allows the countercultural to pick up on it. Maybe we'll see more about that. Sartre says, look, there's two kinds of existentialists. There's religious existentialists, like Karl Jaspers, a German, Gabriel Marcel, a Frenchman, Martin Buber, a Jewish thinker, and there's also atheistic existentialists. Martin Heidegger, whose work influenced Sartre, and Heidegger thought in many ways Sartre misunderstood Heidegger's own work, but that's a story for another day. But Sartre says, look, it really doesn't matter whether you're religious or atheistic, because in effect, it begins with atheism. It's atheistic. Now, how could a religious thinker, a religious existentialist, be also an atheist? And what Sartre is saying is, look, if you think, the story is something like, God made us to be absolutely free to make ourselves. Sartre says, even the choice of adopting that starting point, that there's a God who made us to be radically free, is itself a choice that precedes bringing God into your equation of figuring out your philosophy. So everybody starts from an atheistic position, according to Sartre, which is another way of saying everybody starts in radical freedom of choice. Sartre says, I want to, in fact, pursue a consistently atheistic position. I want to see what it really means if there's no God. God, Sartre thinks, like the tradition thinks, that God is a kind of a designer, but there isn't one. So there's no designer, there's no design, no rule book or blueprint or owner's manual. And Sartre says, in a funny way, it's extremely embarrassing that God does not exist. In other words, we've put a lot into it, and now we're coming to realize there isn't one. Again, maybe, if there was a God, why was there world war not once but twice in the heart of civilization? Why was there the Holocaust? Where's God? Now we know there's no God, but we haven't thought through the implications of that. And this is important for Sartre. Not only does he think that there's no biblical kind of God, a personal kind of God, he thinks there aren't any God substitutes. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, take Kant. That we looked at earlier. Kant says, well, listen, David Hume has a point, right? You look up with your telescope or down into your microscope and you don't see God. So God is not an object for experience. And if, the worry is if God is not there, doesn't exist, everything will run amok. Remember, though, Kant said, don't worry, even if there's not a God that you can experience, rationality demands, is structured in such a way that it has an idea of God. It's structured in such a way that it issues the commands to reason from reason itself, that tells you about the categorical imperative. We have morality. It's absolute. It's built in. Don't worry if there's not a God that you can experience. That's a God substitute. If there's not a lawgiver up in the sky somewhere telling us what to do, then Kant says, don't worry about that. There's a lawgiver built into the nature of rationality itself. Sartre is saying there's no God and no God substitutes. There's nothing that tells us in advance what's right and wrong. So some key characteristics that Sartre brings up in this discussion. First of all, anguish. Right. Wow, that sounds pretty negative. Who wants to be in anguish? But Sartre says, listen, anguish really is about the possibility, the genuine possibility of choice, of choosing one way or another when it matters. So this kind of anguish, he says, is known by all leaders. You'll finish your degree and be in jobs of great responsibility. You will know anguish. You will make decisions about hiring and firing people, about the course of your enterprise or whatever you're involved with. You will know. It's about profound responsibility. It's not just a negative thing. If there weren't any real choices, and we never had to be responsible, well, okay, we would never feel anguish. Sartre's suggesting maybe it's good that we feel anguish because it means we're free to make choices and are responsible. Sartre talks about abandonment. Here's what we're talking about. No God substitutes. We're on our own is what this means, without excuses in our freedom. So if God has abandoned us, Sartre's saying, is that such a bad thing? Maybe we're not just puppets in some God's show, as he might put it, but we are free beings, free to choose. What about the word despair that he likes to use? Well, that means that you're without hope. But all Sartre is saying is hope is the thing that can sometimes paralyze us. What I'm saying when we're in despair as human beings is that we are limited, or we ought to remember that we're limited to what's possible. Hope relies on the impossible. Well, okay, if you're waiting around for the impossible to happen, it's probably not going to happen. If we recognize that we're limited to what's possible, then maybe we'll get busy and try to make the world a little bit better place. So anguish, abandonment, despair, there are these negative words that Sartre likes to talk about. He's trying to get your attention. Remember, he's a novelist. He knows how to tell a story. He's trying to get your attention by giving us all these negative words. But once he has our attention, he tells us, think about what we're really saying. When we leave you in anguish, we mean you're free and responsible. When we say you're abandoned, we mean you're without excuses. It's your life to live and our life to live together. When he says we're in despair, he means let's be realistic. Because when we're not, sometimes we fail to act, right? But if we're realistic, maybe we could make things better for ourselves. About responsibility, he says you're responsible for yourself. Obviously, you are free. There's no user's manual for you, so you have to decide through your choices and actions what you're going to be, and you have no excuses. He's trying to say that you can't say, I was just following orders. You can't say, God commanded it, because you're choosing to talk that way, and in that score, you're responsible. Look, in regular life, we do this all the time. People, you say it, I say, we say, oh, I couldn't come to class. I had to go to the doctor's, or I had to go to a meeting, or I had to attend to something else. We say words like I had to, I needed to, I couldn't help it. And Sartre's saying, no, you're choosing to go to that other meeting instead of come to class. You're choosing to do that. You say you had to, but you didn't have to. You chose to do it. You say, well, I would have lost my opportunity to get a job. Well, then you would have. Maybe that's a good reason why you made the choice you made, but it's a choice that you make. Right? Even on the rack, you can't say, well, I had to give up the information. They were torturing me. Sartre says, basically, no, you could have chosen to die rather than to give out the information to the enemy. Maybe. Are we that free? That's a good question. But he also says that you're not only responsible for yourself, you're responsible for the whole world at the same time. Maybe now there is a little social solidarity to be found in existentialism. What does he mean by that? Well, take for example, and this is not from the lecture, this is my example, but the treatment of a homeless person. You know, you're downtown, the city, you see somebody sleeping over a grate with a cardboard box, and what do? Do you give money? Do you walk past them? Do you go down to City Hall and protest that there should be more services for homeless people? What do you do? Right? And Sartre says whatever action that you take, you're responsible for that. So when you walk by the homeless person, you are acting, you are making a choice, and he thinks in authenticity, in being honest with yourself, you should admit, I am choosing a world in which there are homeless people. You're responsible. When you, I don't know about you, I can't afford very expensive clothes. I can't. I have to buy cheap pants, let's say. Well, in order for me to have cheap pants, there has to be some sweatshop in the other part of the world somewhere where people are paid next to nothing in conditions that are relatively unsafe. In fact, sometimes extremely unsafe, where hundreds of people die in a fire because of the unsafe conditions when they're there making my pants that I buy for cheap over here. Right? Well, in choosing to buy those pants, I am responsible for that fire. To a certain extent, Sartre wants to say. No way of getting around it. We saw something like that in Kant, and we're seeing it again now. So we're responsible for ourselves, but everything that you do and you say, yes, I chose this, I own this, I'm responsible for my action, the consequences are on me. It's also true that how your actions and choices leave the world are also your responsibility. So it's a profound responsibility he's talking about. Sartre gives the example of his pupil who comes to him and says, hey, listen, on the one hand, I got my mother and I got to take care of her. She's got nobody else. And if something were to happen to me, it would be terrible for her. On the other hand, all my compatriots are fighting in the underground against the Nazis. If I go with them, I'm abandoning my mother. If I stay with my mother, I'm, freeloading on the bravery of my compatriots who are fighting the Nazis. What should I do? And Sartre says, there's nobody who can tell you the answer to that question. Even picking a person to ask advice, in a way you're responsible for. If you grew up in a Catholic tradition, so you know how it is sometimes. There are some, you go to confession, and some priests are going to make me do a lot of penance, and some priests are going to be, just say one Hail Mary and you'll be good. And you pick which one of those confessors you go talk to because you have an idea of what advice you're going to get in advance, or you probably wouldn't have sought them out. So nobody can really help you. You're responsible from start to finish for your life and your choices. Morality, Sartre says, is about creativity. It's about invention. But he's not saying morals is just some kind of aestheticism. In other words, like, making your life pretty no matter what else happens. He's not trying to say that. He's just trying to say there is no a priori. We have to make it up as we go along. Because there's no choice. That is how it is for us. We are condemned to be free. There's no way to be unfree. Choosing to think of yourself as unfree is a free choice. Philosophy of action. He says, look, my philosophy is not quietistic at all, right? You are what you do, right? He wants to say there's some people out there, well, you know what, I'm a great novelist, but I just haven't written the book. Sartre says, no, you're not a great novelist until you write the book, right? You are only what you do. He also wants to say, as I just mentioned, you can't not act. You can't not choose. You're always choosing and acting all the time. It requires a life of total commitment to the life that you're living in order to live authentically, as Sartre calls it. Authenticity is this idea that, look, it's you're choosing and owning your choices, but does that leave us in absolute relativism? And Sartre says, no, I don't think that it does, because although you can't judge an action as absolutely right or wrong in advance, you can't do that. You can judge yourself and others based on this idea of authenticity. Did you say, I had to, I couldn't help it, they made me? Are you lying to yourself? Right? Are you doing this sort of performative contradiction where you say I had to, but you're choosing to say I had to? You're contradicting yourself in your own actions and words. At least you could judge that much. If somebody says, I did it, I know what I did, I'm responsible for what I did, it's on me, well, that's authentic. And if somebody says, oh, well, I had to do it, they made me, I couldn't help it, I was just following orders. Okay, what you did, I can't, from some kind of cosmic standpoint, say it was right or it was wrong, but I can say that you yourself are living inauthentically. You're lying to yourself and others by saying you had to do it, when actually the truth of yourself is that you're radically free. So to kind of wind this up, just some similarities and differences with some of the other thinkers we've been talking about. Aristotle, we're unable ever to choose the worst. What we choose is always the better. Well, that's Sartre writing that, but there's a comparison with Aristotle. The difference between Aristotle and Sartre, even though they would both agree with this, we're unable ever to choose the worst, Sartre says. What we choose is always the better. Aristotle would agree with that. Where they would differ is better is not predetermined. Not predetermined. Aristotle says, like Plato would say, the only reason people do bad is out of ignorance. There is the right thing to do, but if we don't know it, we think something else is the right thing to do when it's not. We're choosing it because we think it's the right thing to do, or we'll think we're getting something good out of it, but in our ignorance, we'll find out later that we're not getting something good out of it. Sartre would say, better or worse is never predetermined. Right? You're never measuring your acts up against some kind of predetermined right and wrong. To compare with Augustine, Sartre says it's in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. This whole idea of self-transcendence in St. Augustine, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? It doesn't mean that God looks like a human being. What it means is that God is infinite, and human beings, although finite, have this character of being self-transcendent, that something about human nature always can get beyond itself somehow, always can get beyond its limits. That's a good thing. It allows us to love because we can get up outside of ourselves to others, but it's a dangerous thing because we start to think of ourselves not as just self-transcendent, but as actually infinite, as God, as the true masters. Sartre doesn't worry about that. Aquinas would totally agree with Sartre when Sartre writes that God is an artisan. They have a big disagreement. Aquinas thinks there is the artisan. Sartre thinks there is no God. To compare with Kant, Sartre says man is a legislator. Human beings are legislators, deciding for the whole of humankind. One ought to always to ask oneself what would happen if everyone did as one is doing. I mean, that's really just a paraphrase of the first formula of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that your maxim for acting could be willed to be a universal law. But the difference between Kant and Sartre, as I alluded to earlier, is that Kant thinks that the structure of reason tells you what the right thing to do is. Tells you that. Sartre is just saying, no, think about it, because when you act, you are acting for the whole world. Do you want the whole world acting like that? Your answer might be yes. Kant would say there are certain things like lying that you couldn't say yes to, that you couldn't say you want everybody to lie. Sartre says, nope, there's no backup for this idea about lying. Lying, we choose whether it's good or bad. That's it. We use this term relative absolute when talking about Aristotle. In moral philosophy for Aristotle, there is an absolute. You should be brave. You should be generous. Right? That's an absolute. But how you're brave or generous is relative to you, to how much money you have, to whether you're a trained soldier or just a couch potato philosophy professor. Right? It depends on the situation. Everybody should be generous and brave, but people will be generous and brave in relatively different ways. Same thing about human itself. Human being is human. Right? We have an animal nature, but there's something within humans that drives us beyond humans, as Aristotle said in Book 10, that the maximum life for human beings is more than human. So we're something like divine, but not actually divine. We're an absolute, kind of like God, but only a relative absolute. St. Augustine, human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. Humans are self-transcendent. Again, absolute, but sort of. Relative absolute. Sartre, absolute freedom in a condition. Conditioned freedom. Me being free while you're being free. Well, that might put the brakes. An example. Suppose I say to myself, I'm going to be a great philosophy professor. I'm free to choose to think of myself and to be a great philosophy professor. Except if all the rest of you sit around going, he's really not that great of a philosophy professor. He's a pretty ordinary, maybe not even that good of a philosophy professor. I run up against your freedom to decide what's a good philosophy professor. I run right up against that. So my freedom is always conditioned by the freedom of others and by the natural world, material world. So for Sartre, the content of morality is variable, right? Whatever you do will be different than what other people do, but the form of morality is universal. What's the form? Authenticity, right? And he says that man is all the time outside of himself. So he's conditioned but free. He's something but not quite something, not a finished something. What I like to call a relative absolute. And you can see parallels in Aristotle, a pagan, Augustine, a Christian, and Sartre, a modern or maybe even postmodern atheist. A couple last words on this idea of being and nothingness again. For Sartre, an in itself is the kind of being that just is what it is. It lacks freedom. It's over and done with. It's determined. It's set in stone, so to speak. The for itself is the kind of being that has to determine its own being. And for Sartre, there's only one kind of being that's a for itself. That's human being. That's me and you. Everything else is in itself. So follow this reasoning. This kind of being, this for itself, is not any set kind of thing. As I said before, it's a no thing, a not a thing. So we are nothing, a no thing, yet we hope to be being. We hope to be something. We all want to be something. Me and you, we're all striving to be something. So what is that thing that is no set thing? A thing without any set limits? An infinite thing? Well, the answer to that question is it's God. So Sartre says man, human beings, is the desire to be God. The desire to be God. That's another way of saying for itself. That's another way of saying radical freedom. That's another way of saying no thingness. Right? A desire to be God. To be something that's not any set in advance thing. To be whatever. And it's really puts us in a bind if you think about it. So, you know what? I'd like to be an accountant. I'm going to strive and work hard and learn, and I'm going to be an accountant. And I'll meet you later on. I say, hey, how you doing? What do you do? I'm an accountant. I am an accountant. That's an identity statement. What kind of a thing are you? I'm the accounting kind of thing. That's the thing that I am. But at any given moment, you might not be an accounting thing. You might change your mind. You might decide you want to be a doctor kind of a thing, or an artist kind of a thing, or a mother kind of a thing, or an astronaut kind of a thing. You will never just simply over and done with be an accountant, or a husband, or a wife, or a Republican, or a Democrat. We don't get to just be something according to Sartre. It's always a matter of every morning getting up and choosing again to do it. If we're authentic with ourselves, if we're honest with ourselves, that's what's going on. To say, oh, I just have to be this is just it. Well, it doesn't have to be, right? You're absolutely free in this way of thinking, like God is absolutely free. And again, you can see this similarity with Augustine, that the trouble we get into, according to St. Augustine, is that in our self-transcendence, we feel ourselves free, a kind of a freedom, a truncated liberty, he says in the a translation of his writings in his Confessions, a cut off, not quite all the way there, liberty, but liberty. And but our mistake is we keep thinking we're absolute liberty. We are God, and therefore we don't need God anymore. In Augustine's eyes, that's sin. That's original sin. That's the sin of all sin. So it's interesting. Augustine the Christian, Sartre the atheist, still can't get away from thinking about the concept of God and how it operates with us. Lastly, there's two kinds of humanism that Sartre talks about. There's a kind of humanism that determines humans as persons. It has a specific kind of a content, that the human is an end in itself, a supreme value, and every other individual human person is determined, their worth, their value is determined by this idea of what human is. There's another kind of humanism that says humanism is that humans always transcend humans, that nothing outside of humanity is really in the end limiting humanity. And Sartre only agrees with humanism in this second sense. Right? He gives an example of somebody like, wow, human beings flew to the moon. It's not his exact example, but human beings flew to the moon. Wow, aren't I great because human beings have flown to the moon? Aren't I great? And Sartre says, well, you didn't fly to the moon. Those human beings over there put that whole project together, flew to the moon. Good for them, but you don't get anything from that. That doesn't carry over to you. You didn't do that. Stop taking credit for it. The humanist in the first sense says, I get the value of every wonderful thing that humans have ever done or could do. Sartre says, no, what's human about you is that you're not stuck. What's human about you is that you're free. What's human about you is that you're responsible. What's human about you is that there's no set thing that you really are.